Hello everyone, welcome. My name's Michael Anderson. I work in the faculty, not the faculty, yes I do work in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, but I also work in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work. But for the purposes of this forum, I'm the interdisciplinary lead in charge of the interdisciplinary work that's going on in FAS. But before I go any further, I want to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I also want to recognise that a big part of the resource that we're talking about today is actually based on Aboriginal knowledges and Aboriginal ideas, and so that's very much part of the discussion that we want to have today as well. So it's not a disjointed acknowledgement, it's an acknowledgement of the work that we've been doing and the work we will continue to do. I want to also introduce Dr. Justine Sheep-Peterson, who is part and is the creator of the audio walk that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to kind of talk about the layers that are involved in creating an audio walk and why you would create an audio walk. And Dr. Paul Dwyer, who comes from performance studies, but also is part of the experience. He was a beta tester.
Yes.
And so he's our kind of professional user, so to speak, who'll give us some insights, certainly from his academic background, but also from his understanding of the way that the whole process has worked and how it works in a dramatic frame and a performance frame. I want to say, if you have any questions or you want to make any comments, don't feel like you have to wait till the comment or question time. Feel free to just throw a question in any time. We won't mind being interrupted, and we'll try and kind of respond to them. So if there's something burning you want to ask, please feel free to do so. I'm going to throw the first question to Justine. So, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing for the interdisciplinary project, the Audio Walk, and how it came about, and what in your background that kind of oriented you to this kind of work?
Yeah, sure. So the project is called Changing Pathways, and it's a site-based audio walk of the Westmead precinct. And I've been kind of working with audio. I think the first audio walk that I did was like more than 12 years ago, so sort of like early to mid 2000s. There were a couple of things I did. I went to the Forbidden City in Beijing, and I did the audio walk, which in English was narrated by Roger Moore. And I had this experience of standing at the back of the Gate for Heavenly Peace or something like that, and Roger Moore says something like, "Look up at the ceiling, isn't it fabulous?" Something, and he kind of, it was very intimate. It was like an earpiece that went into your ear. You had Roger's crooning voice. He's very popular in China, does lots of commercials, and to have his intimate voice in my ear, and I was kind of standing there with this very embodied experience of, like, as though I were Puyi, the last emperor, standing kind of looking at my people below me. And so I kind of had this thing of, sound is really interesting in order to give us spatial and embodied experience. It's more than just like a recording in my ear kind of thing. And then in about 2005, I came across the work of the Canadian artist Janet Cardiff, who's really famous. She's sometimes credited as kind of coining this term audio walk. She was a sort of sculptor, and she made a lot of installation work in the 80s and 90s using some sound, but very gallery-based installation work. And then she talks about this incident she had walking in a graveyard one day, and she was just taking notes in a dictaphone and playing them back to herself as she was walking around the graveyard, just thinking about a project. She kind of makes sort of dark film noir-y kind of work, so that location seems appropriate. And she had this kind of very visceral reaction to the time shift of hearing herself 5 minutes ago in that spot. And she had this revelation about how she could actually use that to give an experience of kind of walking with the other. And I use binaural sound in the work that I do primarily as inherited from Janet Cardiff. So there are lots of different approaches to sound walks and audio walks within the arts and with also in tourist productions that deploy that technology slightly differently. But one of the things that I find really important is about how we can use that technology, which is incredibly lo-fi. It's really ephemeral. For a public artwork in a public place, it doesn't require you to put up an informational panel or a bollard or a rope or a sculpture of anything. The listener brings it with them, and yet it gives them such an embodied kind of and temporal experience of that place. And so it's kind of eerie. We talked a little bit before about some of the students doing this walk, and they're kind of, it's a little bit scary. The idea, or creepy, the idea that you're getting to go on a walk with me, that you can hear through the soundscape was walked by me. So I'm in some way there with you in a kind of ghostly presence, is one of the core parts.
Do you want to tell us what that technology you talked about, binaural?
Binaural, so it's very simple. It just uses two small microphones that when you record, you put them, so you can get really fancy ones that you can get embedded within a separate head and you carry a head around. But you can also just use little microphones and sort of put them where your ears would be, or in your ears. And what they do is, we're super sophisticated listeners. We can spatially place things through our listening in really, really sophisticated ways. And it's because of the shape of our ear and the way the sound wave kind of hits our head and goes around to the other side, or, bends around our ear, fold, and comes back in. And so if you record with the microphones placed there, and then you listen back with sort of speakers where those microphones were, that is earphones, you get that spatialization of sound. So you can play lots of tricks. If I walk up behind you, you hear somebody walking up behind you. But it also does an incredibly lifelike recording of atmospheric sound. And it's used a lot for people who want to go to classical music concerts and surreptitiously record a really high quality recording of that illegally. It's also used a lot by people who do field recordings for sound works as well.
And it's completely different in terms of those who've gone out and experienced it. It's completely different to kind of just having kind of stereo sound or whatever.
Yeah.
It is almost like a dome around your head.
If you were to listen to it like on your computer or just in a normal speaker setup, it would just sound like stereo sound. It's it's placed in left and right channels. But when you listen to it through earphones and have it in your ears, it suddenly makes the space and the people that are recorded on the sound, all the body movements, etc., come out to you in a like 3D spatialized way. There was a Canadian filmmaker, he talked about it in regards to Janet Cardiff's work. He talked about it as MSG for the senses, so that it makes you kind of super sensory aware, not only through sound, because you can hear both the recording and the real world sort of laminated together, but because of that eeriness, your sense of touch, your sense of sight, your sense of everything is kind of put on hyper alert.
Yeah. So, Paul, I want to take you back to a discussion that we had, kind of October, November last year, where I said, oh, look, I've got this big problem. I've got to get 1,000 students to kind of understand and get their head around Westmead.
Yes, that is a big problem.
Yeah, that was a big problem. And you said, oh, no, I've got just the thing.
No, I didn't say that. I said...
Well, that's my memory of it.
I said, I know just the person.
Yeah, that's actually
Justine
true.
Scherr-Pearson.
You did say that.
And she has done a fantastic job, and I urge everyone who's here in the room, you can download the recordings that Justine has made and have this experience. And the experience you'll have will not be just listening to your playlist on iTunes. It will be, as she's saying, a very much a totally immersed, emplaced, embodied, visceral experience. But the problem that you came with was, what can be a focus for third-year students in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences who are coming from many different disciplines, majoring in many different disciplines? What can be a point of focus around which they gather? And that's a really hard question. And there would be lots of different models. And personally, I think that this unit of study you're piloting now, with the use of the audio walk incorporated into it, I think that's one model. And I think over time the faculty will probably add a few more models. So I don't think you can pump thousands of students through this experience, but you can pump quite a few dozen, and maybe even, if you stagger it carefully, you could maybe 100 or so. But I thought the issue might be around place, because you said that for various reasons the university would love it if this interdisciplinary unit somehow encouraged students to think about the university's strategy for moving into Western Sydney, creating a campus with teaching and research activities as part of the redevelopment of Western Sydney, Westmead, Parramatta precinct. And I said, the students have to know what that place is, and they can't learn what that place is just from looking at websites. No matter how snazzy, in fact, the greater, the Commission for Greater Sydney, Lucy Turnbull stuff, no matter how snazzy it looks, no matter how snazzy the University of Sydney stuff looks, that's a very shallow form of learning. A place-based experiential visit of the site would be a really good place to start, and that can be done in a very aesthetic way, which, as Justine was just saying, really heightens all of their senses. So have that experience first, and then these students have something to talk about, because they've actually had a visceral, embodied, situated and placed encounter with the hospital site.
So it's interesting you're talking about the heightened senses, but I also think it's an emotional engagement.
Yes, totally. So the thing about sound, which it's a commonplace to say, but it bears repeating. Sound is at the one and the same time, it's the most intimate, personal medium, and it's the most public medium. The sounds that Justine has recorded make their way into my ear, into my body, and are resonating in my body. So sound is the medium which forces you to try and reconcile your sense of self and your sense of being placed in an environment.
And I mean, there are some people who write about things like, the hierarchy of the senses, which is kind of very old research that needs to be challenged. But this idea that, we're very visually based, culturally speaking, we're very visually based. And, in today's world too, where hardly any surface is not used to project something at us, advertising, whatever. And so we're incredibly savvy at filtering out or distancing or whatever from visual sight, because we're taught to read and look at images and all of that all the time. And we don't have those same sort of, I suppose, encultured ways of responding to things like sound. Smell would be another one. People often talk about, the smell of someone who's passed away. You get their old clothes or something, and memories come flooding back to you. So the way that things like smell and sound are able to sort of tap into memory, emotional experience, all of those sorts of things.
But I also want to add to this the way in which the audio walk as a performance experience. So it is a performance experience. You don't have to be a performer. You can just be an ordinary schmuck or an ordinary student, but you sign up for this experience with...
Call you an everyday
person, okay. You sign up with this experience, you've downloaded the material that Justine's recorded and carefully curated the sound of it, and you just put your little earbuds in and off you go, and you are having a co-created performance experience of that place. But I think what it does is what Bertolt Brecht, the theatre director, famously called, it creates a kind of, he used the German word Verfremdungseffekt, so it's a device for making the familiar strange. And, you think you know what a hospital is, we've all been there a few times. You carry that, there's emotional baggage, of course, for some people that you carry, maybe the last time you visited the hospital was to say goodbye to your mum. I mean, in my case it was. I hadn't been to a hospital since being with my mum in her final hours, so going to a hospital was already quite a highly charged experience. But there's also what's happening in the in the audio walk is I'm aware that I'm having certain experiences, but other people have inhabited this place. So there's a couple of parts of the audio walk where you might be walking down a long corridor, and at the time when I was walking down it, I was completely alone. There was no one else in this corridor, but I heard the footsteps of other people, and I'm kind of looking around and going, my God, who else is living here? What other stories have been lived out here? And this is bubbling up, this excitement and emotional excitement. Or sometimes I open a door to go down a staircase, and or the elevator door's open, and I see a patient, you know, and they're not at death's door, but there's a patient being wheeled to, you know, a ward or something. And I can hear these noises, and there's a blurring of the noises that are actual live situational noises. Like if I'm walking through the cafeteria, there is some spillage, especially if you've just got the small earbuds. So there's some spillage from those sounds, but then there's these other sounds. And it's so powerful, particularly when you walk. The walk takes you through the hospitals and then further into the precinct to the forgotten parts of the precinct, really.
Yeah.
The Cumberland Psychiatric Hospital, the Parramatta Female Factory, places of, you know, immense heritage significance and problematic histories. And, you know, to have... is this okay if I just...
Yeah, I want to throw to Justine to ask her why she made that choice.
Okay, but I just want to describe one bit of that.
Yeah, go for it.
There's a moment near the end of the walk where Justine's very gentle narration voice, this guide that you have with you on the walk, just encourages you to run your hand across the kind of tessellated surface of the sandstone wall of the Parramatta Female Factory. It's so simple and brought me to tears, you know, because I'm aware of the absolutely, you know, appalling treatment that people experienced in that place. But I've heard the voices of survivors of the place, which are strong, proud voices, and I'm having to make... Imagine for a student, what a rich learning experience. It's not a history lecture that they've just looked up on a PowerPoint slide because they slept in. They're there in the place. They're running their hands across that place. History is in their fingertips for a moment. So I just want to stress that the emotional aspect of the experience comes partly from the emotional baggage and the personal history that you bring to the place, but also through this sense of other people have been here, other things have happened in this place. The place never stops performing its heritage and its history and its significance. It's 24 hours a day. I'm here as a visitor. I'm in it, but I'm not of it. Yeah. Anyway, so
and I really endorse that visceral. I mean, that moment when you walk from the hospital into the dental hospital and the smell changes like a smack in the face, like it is. And the way you narrate it, I think, no, the smell. Oh yeah, the smell has changed. It's an extraordinary moment. But
ask her the question.
Yeah. So okay, thank you. Yeah. So the moment that you kind of you go out of the Westmead Hospital per se, or the two hospitals, the Children's Hospital, and then you go through the Cumberland. Why did you decide to do that? Why did you? Because it wasn't excluded in the brief, but it wasn't necessarily.
No, it had a very open brief actually. Yeah. There was just we want to get the students out to this site, and so for me, I mean, Paul's kind of bringing up sort of philosophical ideas about what place is, which really underlie my work as well, and place-making kind of methodologies. So this idea that, you know, a place is made of, it's soaked with all of its history and inhabitants, the people that use it, that belong to it, and therefore, and all of those scars and uses and whatever leave a kind of archaeological remain there that you can see by visiting that place. And, you know, so my process it's very organic. I go out and I spend a lot of time. It's a little bit like ethnographic field work of I'm just sitting, I'm doing what people there are doing, I'm watching what other people are doing. I chatted to Sandy, who's one of the dental nurses in the dental hospital over Christmas. You know, I was also working on this over Christmas, so it was really interesting. I went out there, you know, all through the Christmas holidays, so I got to see sort of like different people who maybe got, you know, shunted with the Christmas shift and all sorts of things. The root comes collecting stories and collecting memories and interviews with people, and the root comes hand in hand. There's no way you can go, I'll walk this way and somehow fit the story I want to tell into that, or the other way around, because it's super technical in that, often you go, oh, I want to tell this story as we walk here, but I just don't have enough footsteps to do it. It's a response to the place, but it also has to somehow fit together. And that's, for me, I can't explain very well how that process goes because it's very organic. But immediately when I went out there, I realized there was this kind of hole in which nobody at the other hospitals in the precinct really talked much about Cumberland or the female factory. And actually, the first time I went out to site, I was like, oh, I know the female factory is out here. I was, totally ignorant. I'm embarrassed and appalled enough to say that I knew very little about the Westmead precinct and the Parramatta Park precinct, even though I've lived in Sydney for 10 years. I'd never been out to the female factory. And I had assumed somehow that it would have some kind of small museum there. And I looked it up, and it was marked on Google Maps, and it was mismarked on Google Maps to another building that was there in the Cumberland Psychiatric Hospital, which was obviously a building from the 1940s. And I was like, and then it's like, oh, actually there's convict stone over there. Oh, there's all these buildings over there. And it was totally unmarked. There's not a memorial plaque, there's nothing.
And it's a very contested site.
Very contested site, especially with the redevelopment going on in Parramatta at the moment. And not only that, but Cumberland also, so what's happening to Cumberland, the psychiatric hospital, as part of the redevelopment is kind of not entirely clear. It's thought about as a different campus, although it stretches, half of it's on the Westmead side of the river and half of it's on the Parramatta side of the river. And what I believe is that the Westmead side will be part of the new hospital precinct. But to me, so finding out about that, it is walking back in time. So if you start from Westmead Hospital, the adult hospital, you get that was built in the 70s and is a little bit down at heel. It's very obvious that it was this brutalist building built in the 1970s. The children's hospital that was built in the 90s, the mid-90s. You're getting a kind of history lesson just from that place about what our changing ideas of the hospital and healthcare are. You go to Cumberland, half of the buildings are empty and closed already. There's a lot of it built in from probably the 1940s to the 1970s. It's very beautiful around the river there, but it's also got a slightly abandoned feeling. For anyone who has had experience with people in psychiatric care, I think it can be a very hard place to go and visit. And then you come to this convict era building, which is actually there in its development in the female factory. They built a lunatic asylum which became Cumberland Hospital. So in fact there is a direct historical relationship from the female factory to the psychiatric hospital, then across the river to how we have these institutions. So in fact, I kind of went from going, I know nothing about this place, to going, this is one of the most interesting sites in Australia, if not the world. That it has contained within its site basically all of our history, our relationships to country. It was also a very important Darug meeting site for many, many years. It's contentious, but perhaps also a birthing site for Darug women, very close to where the female factory is. So it's the site of Australia's first lying-in hospital for women in the female factory. So not only convict women were sent there, but any women in the original colony went in there to have children. And in its first years were interned in there because it was unsafe for them, because they were hugely outnumbered by men in the colony. So they were actually, even if you were a free woman, at nighttime you have to go in and be locked into the female factory. It's estimated that something like 1 in 600 people in Australia can trace their heritage back to the female factory. So it's one of the most significant convict sites in Australia that is also about our colonial displacement of Aboriginal people, and all the way to the way that we're going to be a research, innovation, and
all bells and whistles.
All bells and
shining.
whistles, kind of. So it's incredibly interesting for that fact. So I couldn't tell the story of that place without going to come.
No, and it's just to contextualise. So the journey that Justine, as narrator, takes you along is very, very kind of clever. It creeps up on you a little bit. You start with this. The first track in the audio walk sort of is maybe what you would listen to the night before, or when you're on the train, catching the train out to Westmead. And it sort of says, meet me at the Sahaj restaurant, on, I can forget the name of the road, which is opposite the main Westmead hospital entrance. And so you're there, and she just invites you to look around, and you can see the billboards for all the new housing developments, and you get a little bit of the soundtrack of the Greater Sydney Commission pumping, talking about all the exciting changes that are happening here. And so you get all that, and you're thinking, what are they going to do here? Who's going to live here? How's this going to work? And then gradually you go through the hospital and you start thinking, people live here, people work here, people come here to deal with some of the most profound experiences of their lives, illness, birth, death, all of that. And then just like Justine's voice becomes a little less present, and you have to take a bit more responsibility as the walker the further you go, and you get to these places where much less has been planned up front on the websites and in the snazzy planning documents, and you're starting to have to take responsibility for how you relate to these places of contested history, and what will become of those places in the redevelopment of the bright, shiny, Westmead precinct.
So, taking the focus out slightly from this project, but thinking about audio walks in general, what kind of, pedagogically or in an educational sense, what are they good for? Or how can they be used?
Well, I have made the argument in some of my academic work in the past that it is a pedagogical genre, because in a way what you're being taken on a walk with someone, and I've cited some and written about some where it's very explicit. Be me. You're going to walk with me. Be like me. But even if you don't make that explicit, because in fact what that ends up doing is going, oh my God, you're too close to me. I don't want to be here, But what I think the genre does is invite you to, because you're spending time with me. I mean, any good tour guide, even a live tour guide that takes you on a tourist, walk around a neighborhood, would do this of, you're seeing the world through my eyes in a way. And what I try and do is I build in not only things that you're looking at, but so the smell in the dental hospital, I'm also sort of inciting you to, either by the stories that I tell or the instructions that I give you, to have a kind of sensory experience of the world too. And to me it doesn't work, like I was saying before that we started, that the walker has to trust me to want to go with me and do the things that I tell you to do. And so you have to build a kind of rapport. And part of that is about, I suppose, so I'm inviting you in a way to come with me and to see the world like me, but without doing it in a way that is going to distance you and make you not want to follow me. But some of the work that I've done in audio walks is around particularly explicit sort of ethnic, cross-racial, be like me situations, or intercultural ones. And what I've kind of argued about them is that you may fail to be the other person, be the other, but you also fail to be like your normal self. So it is that defamiliarization with your normal way. So I'm not just going to hurry through this environment, or I might know this environment really well. I hope some people who work at Westmead do the walk, and I'd be very interested to hear their feedback about how it maybe opens them up to an environment they actually use and know really, really well. So there, to me, that is a pedagogical relationship to let me kind of take your hand and come with me and try and learn about it this way. Right? And it's using, I suppose, a different kind of like learning apparatus. Like I'm particularly going, let's use the different kinds of learning skills that you have, which are not about just I hear, lectures and I write down notes and I get my information that way, but you have a lot of embodied knowledge about being in the world just because of, by the time you got to university, you've had 20 years of being in the world. And how can you use that to actually actively become an agent in learning about this place?
But it's also the kind of ultimate experiential learning, because you're in the middle of the experience, and you're in the middle of the context.
Yeah.
And so it is embodied, but it's also experiential. But it's guided in, you can have experiential learning where you've got to work out everything for yourself, but you are actually being guided through that experience, which is a difference as well, I think, in terms of the pedagogy. What do you think, Paul, about that?
I'm just thinking through. I mean, there's all kinds of audio walks. There's a spectrum. I mean, I guess for most people, the most familiar reference point would be, you go to some famous art gallery and you haven't had time to do the crash course in art history and theory, so you pay for the, audio walk and you stick this thing in your ear, and it's kind of telling you, in a way, quite a lot about here's what you should be thinking about this artwork. This is Picasso's, Rose period, and it's important because, and you kind of come away, and that's a fairly superficial learning. It's useful up to a point. At the other end of the scale, the sort of thing that Justine is doing is she's not telling you what to think as a narrator, but she's inspiring you into a state of receptivity where you're thinking, I have to think about this, I have to respond to this. So little things like Justine, has, as a person like me with a pretty crook back, I mean more crook than me, I think, and so Justine sometimes has some mobility issues depending on how her back is at any point in time, so she will often walk with a cane, and on the audio walk she's walking with a cane, and she kind of gently points that out to the listener that you might have to, you might be walking a bit faster than me or a bit slower than me. I walk with the cane, and that has certain implications. And you kind of, it's not like I'm, as a person experiencing the walk, and becoming Justine. She's not me. She's made that clear because I haven't got a cane with me at that point. But she's also not me. She's inviting me to think and feel. How would it be for me when I'm older? How will it be when I'm older? How will I be in this place? So I think most of the learning that happens in the audio walk is because you're in between everything. You're in between the past of this Westmead precinct, the present and the future. You're in between your normal habitual sense of self and your sense of what others are doing in this place, or what Justine was doing when she made the walk. And I think when people, it's kind of, not unpleasant way, it's disorienting. And I think that's where, in this audio walk, I think that's where the profound learning happens, as opposed to a kind of more...
You say not unpleasant.
Yeah.
But I think for some people it is highly unpleasant. If you have never had to think about a different way of being in the world than what you have, I think it could be quite unpleasant.
Could be a job.
But for all the people, who have had some experience in which you've had to adjust your way of being in the world, then that is the experience of it, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, but I think that's where it becomes, because of the embodied nature of the experience, the emplaced nature of the experience, the heightened sensorial nature of the experience that we've talked about. I think it can promote a deeper learning than the kind of surface learning that happens with a conventional art gallery audio walk.
Yeah, and maybe that's fast tracking. That's fast tracking because it's a little bit like they're being taken out to site. They're given this experience which to different degrees might kind of jolt you out of your kind of comfortable normal experience. And in this class then they're a little bit like they are turned on to then be receptive to kind of the other information.
Sorry, and that's the other thing that I wanted to just jump in there and say, is that having had the experience, then students can apply themselves with their particular sets of disciplinary expertise to thinking about this site. The history majors have got lots to talk about in terms of heritage. The philosophy majors have got lots to talk in terms of, subjectivity. The linguists can talk about, the discourse, do a discourse analysis of the policy documents that are telling us what we should be thinking about this site. The theatre and performance studies students have got something to work. The English students can talk about the genres of memoir that are shared with some of the interviewees and all that sort of thing. I think there's lots, I wouldn't say every single discipline has got a point of access, but I think lots of disciplines within our faculty have a point of access to this. But first they've had the experience of site that has made them, it really is quite a challenging experience of the site.
And I just wanted to, I made a note of this earlier when you did the acknowledgement of country, that that idea of, we're kind of talking site-specific art or place-making philosophies or whatever, are not out of whack with Indigenous approaches to thinking about country. So the idea that, history, cultural knowledge, kinship relationships, all of those things are bound together through this, wonderful Indigenous expanded concept of country, is in a way a little bit, it is a guide for me in doing this kind of work too.
Okay. We've probably been talking long enough to give people pause for questions. Are there any questions that people have got about anything we've said or discussed thus far? James, I thought you might have a question.
This was sort of really interesting to hear. So I'm in the Department of Archaeology here, but I'm also one of the people who's helping to develop this unit. And it was sort of, I had this very fragmentary moment where I've been involved with at least visiting some of the archaeology that's happening around that Parramatta North precinct, Cumberland precinct, and sort of approach it from one direction. And then we went to visit Westmead with the group from another direction, but of course didn't connect the dots. So it was sort of fascinating hearing, that you did that. And I think that's actually a wonderful way of sort of approaching that kind of landscape, is a walk back through time. And it's sort of, we might talk afterwards about how to integrate some of that archaeological knowledge into ways that people walk around that landscape. For example, the excavation of the ha-ha, which was, the history of mental institutions, rather than building a wall, which makes your patients feel trapped, changing notions about care for the insane in the 19th century, they instead would dig a ditch and put the wall in the ditch so you can walk around the grounds and you feel like you're sort of, not trapped. But of course, if you get too close to the wall, you realize, and that's why they call it ha-ha. Anyway, thinking about things like it is, because you get to the wall and go, oh, ha-ha. And apologies in advance, this really isn't a question so much as just kind of a slightly rambling comment. But, thinking about how to integrate that kind of, disciplinary knowledge into a much broader sense, and how do we understand the landscape, how do we understand a place as somewhere that has history, and getting the students to kind of take that sensibility and then, maybe even walk back through the 1970s and the 1990s and say, okay, well, this stuff is here, but it wasn't always here. And, thinking about moving yourself backwards and forwards through time.
Yeah. But of course, a lot of what is there now was there in the 70s and the 1890s and the whatever.
Exactly.
And so I think it is about like turning on some eye or some sort of receptor to the history that's around you, that's sometimes built over, so you have to look for it. But also, you might be interested, there's a performance scholar who's Welsh named Mike Pearson, and he worked with an archaeologist named Michael Shanks, and came up with this they wrote a book together called Theatre Archaeology, in which they looked at some of the sort of performance, the approaches to making site-specific performance and also documenting performance. And approaches within archaeology to thinking about the site, the crime scene, the whatever, and how you might take a taxonomy of site and as an approach to how to work with site. And so that was actually some really interesting interdisciplinary kind of knowledge that they came up with. But yeah, the idea that, you know, it's also, I think, both thinking with the period eye to something that happens, that or the site as it was, but using that same defamiliarization and that same acute observation to then turn back on your contemporary world is actually what I think is really useful for, you know, we're talking about undergraduate students who may have a little bit of experience of getting to do their own research by the time they're in third year, but some of them maybe not, and how they become kind of turned on researchers to the real world is kind of one of the things that this course I think is trying to you know, activate.
And like I'm really trying to just think, I haven't, you know, I'd love to talk with you more, James, about your what you think the students are getting out of it so far, but I'm really trying to think, you know, what if you had 5 students having to collaborate on some sort of group research project, and it's meant to have some connection to the University of Sydney Westmead strategy, and you're kind of thinking, well, what are they going to do together? And I'm actually quite excited about the idea that maybe they've all had this performative experience of the place, and then you've got a student who's maybe majoring in accounting, and you've got a student who's majoring in philosophy, and a student who's majoring in, you know, anthropology or something, and they might sit there and they might pore over the plans, you know, for the redevelopment of the site. And I think the accountancy student's going to be thinking, okay, it's not just a number crunching box. Like if they spend that much on how much have they left over for the development of the Parramatta Female Factory memory site? Not much, but I was out there. It's actually a really important place. Or, you know, I think there's a chance for students with different disciplinary affiliations to really wrestle with each other about what does this place mean for the people who are living there now, for the people who are supposedly going to move into all of these residential apartment blocks, for the people who work there every day, for the bureaucrats at the University of Sydney, for the Lucy Turnbull and her team in the Greater Sydney Commission. What does this place mean? You know, in all kinds of ways, in a dollars and cents kind of way, in an historical sense, in a gender and cultural studies sense, in, you know...
Even getting them to think about things like non-human actors that live in that
totally.
place. So we did
the colony of bats down on the river
last year. And one of those popular attractions was not the old sandstone foundations and the ha-ha that was full of hospital beds and all this kind of stuff, but it was the bat colony that lives along the river, right?
Yes.
Thinking, okay, well, if we have sort of 4 million people moving into that area of Parramatta in the next 50 years or whatever, how does that impact the bats and the eels and all the creatures we have to share that space?
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
I saw Brian putting one via Twitter, and he says, I love the Roger Moore references that help shape the idea of the audio walk, and are there plans for more audio walks at other locations?
What are your plans, Justine?
Well, I basically worked non-stop during February, including overnight, to get it done for the beginning of the semester. So I've had like the last 4 weeks off. So I have no plans at the moment. But, I mean, as we talked about in the beginning too, it also, this unit is, you know, in a pilot this year, right? But if all third year students are taking it in the future, we're talking about a large number of students.
Hundreds.
Then you go, how do you actually study site without your impact on the site overwhelming it and therefore not being able to study it? You know, so you can't get 1,000 students to go out there and do a walk together because all they're going to be looking at is each other. They're no longer going to, you know, it's like they'll have to shut down the hospital for that to happen. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what the future is for this unit, but it would be a fun thing to kind of do some more. It's
I think you could. I think you could identify, you know, a dozen places where there's contested histories, contested futures across Sydney, and I think that would promote a lot of interdisciplinary research outcomes for students. I think there will be, this is my personal feeling, is that there will also and should also be a place for other kinds of interdisciplinary units. There is still a place for an interdisciplinary reading course, for example. And what does the student who's majoring in classical Greek, what's their access to this kind of work that we're talking about here? It's a little bit trickier.
I also wonder whether there's a potential kind of. I know the ABC's doubling down on its podcasts at the moment. I know we're not talking about podcasts, but to do kind of a series of site-based things that people don't only just listen to when they're on the beach, but actually kind of explore their own areas and the voices from their own communities.
Yeah, there was a guy who, and this is a genre that actually it predates podcasting because it predates iPods. And so, some of the first ones I listened to where you had a Sony Discman, which you carried around with you, borrowed and carried around and listened to it that way. But of course the explosion, we're kind of having this, and in Australia particularly, there's been this marked interest in listening to audiobooks, and podcasting has really kind of made radio come alive again. We thought this was old technology, but actually in the last 20 years we've seen this sort of resurgence of podcasting. There definitely is this guy in Shanghai, because of the huge rate of development that was going on in the 90s and 2000s. He would do neighborhood walks with people, talking about their childhood home, which was in the process of being demolished. Just huge areas of the city and city blocks and old hutongs and things like that being demolished to make way for new development. And so now, I guess that exists as this weird thing where you would walk around and listen to someone describing what used to be there that has kind of been erased, which would be really interesting. There are lots of. I think it's a really flexible kind of technology that is great for oral history and storytelling and all sorts of things.
Oh, look, I'm about to take off on study leave to Northern Ireland, where I'm doing some work on theatre and the politics of reconciliation. I could imagine an amazing arts-based project that would work across communities there, using interviews with people and binaural field recording technology, so that someone from the nationalist side of politics could experience some of the intimate voices of people from a more loyalist background, and vice versa. There could be I think there would have been an extraordinary way to promote a feelingful sense of what has this other community member gone through, and not to demolish their experience. So often with theatre processes and arts processes, we say, oh, this will be great, this will encourage empathy for the other, and often what it does is it obliterates the other. I think there's a complication of empathy with this sort of work that Justine's doing, where you kind of sense that there is this other experience, there's someone else who's worked and lived in this place, and they're not me, but by God they're important, and by my existence in this earth depends quite a lot on their existence. And I think that's a much more ethical space when you complicate empathy rather than just treat empathy as this, I'm, what's the Atticus Finch line? I've walked around in your shoes, so I don't need those shoes anymore. I can go back to the ones I normally wear. Yeah.
Other questions?
Well, I've got a question for the audience. How many people would like to go out to Westmead now and do the audio walk?
Oh.
And for the viewers at home, that's 100%.
Yeah. So I suppose the question that came before about what's the future. I mean, if you could curate another 5 projects, what would they be and what would they look like?
I think Westmead could have another one. Westmead Parramatta could have another one. I think originally we talked about it being 30 minutes. It's 52 minutes, this audio walk. So I felt like I had to edit a lot out. So I think there could be another one there. I've also, I don't know if anyone's from media marketing here at the university, but when the university did their campaign, their last advertising campaign, which was all kind of like old alumni as like the leaders of today sort of thing, I was thinking, that is true. There's so many great alumni here. It would be really fun to do a audio walk of this Camperdown campus as well, in which you could involve some voices of old scholars and, a lot of the lore that is embedded within the buildings here from student perspectives. That would be really fun to do. I'm naturally, I actually, you came to me, but I was actually really excited to do something in a hospital, which is a kind of, on first glance, seems a very bland kind of environment. And previous to this, I spent 10 years studying airports and doing a lot of walking around ethnographic fieldwork in airports. So I'm kind of drawn to these environments which are a little bit unmarked, but in fact are like used by many people, and which a lot of our kind of human life actually happens in. And so I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I'm like, I'd look for those kinds of
There's a
places.
bunch of things that you'll know when you see it.
Yeah, they're like institutional spaces, and yet life happens in relief against the kind of institutional rules and things like that. I think they're interesting sites to
Justine's read a lot of Michel de Certeau and
Yes.
all that sort of stuff. So
Yeah.
people
Fantastic.
making places in their own ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not following the strategy that's laid
Yeah.
down by the bureaucracy.
Well, that seems a good place to end. Can I thank Justine Shee Pearson and Paul Dwyer for their time today, and for your energetic part in it as well. Thank you. Justine, can you stay for 5 minutes to answer
sure.
fan questions?
Yes, sure.
And if you want to download the walking tour to do it, we can make it available to everyone. We'll certainly post where you can get that from, but it is available to you all. So thank you very much.